Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I talked last week about cell culture studies and how you have to be very careful when you're looking at results from cell culture studies. You have to be very careful about drawing conclusions because cell culture is not the same as looking at a substance in animal tissues. I wanted to add to that, and I wanted to talk about the difference between cause and effects and associations. Because I think that this is another area you see reports about nutrition and about nutritional science in the mainstream media, and whether the journalists don't understand the difference between a cause and effect or an association, or whether they ignore it, I would suggest it's probably the former of the two. You see confusion. And that leads to confusion in the public because there are things that are reported that are not necessarily true based on the original data. If we have a look at the difference between a cause and effect and the types of studies that would look at cause and effects and the type of studies that maybe look at associations, cause and effects are generally investigated in clinical trials. They're invested in animal models, and they're investigated also in cell culture. And effectively what you do is you take a group of people, a group of animals, a group of cells, you apply a chemical or a nutrient to those cells, and then in comparison to some untreated cells or some untreated animals or some untreated humans, you see if there is a change in a particular parameter. If a addition of a chemical causes a change in a particular biochemical parameter, you can be fairly confident, as long as you have adequate controls, you can be fairly confident that that nutrient, that drug, that chemical has caused that effect. And if you repeat the experiment and you do it on a large enough population, the likelihood that that is true increases, and the statistical significance will increase as well. That is how you really need to measure a cause and effect. If we look at associations, really, when we look at associations, the branch of science that tends to look at associations and correlations in terms of nutrition and drugs, and particularly in disease, is epidemiology. Now, epidemiology is really the science of looking at disease risk within populations. And many of the associations that we know between disease and particular factors have come from epidemiology. So, for example, we can say that as people age, there is an increased risk of them having cardiovascular disease. Many of these types of associations have been measured in epidemiology, and epidemiology differs from the other branches of science in that you are showing associations and correlations. You are showing that two factors are related, but you cannot say that one has caused the other. There may be a third variable that has caused both of those factors to change. I'll try and give you a very easy to understand analogy. If you look at road traffic accidents, you tend to find police cars. There is an association between road traffic accidents and police cars. As you observe an increase in the number of accidents on the road, you would probably notice an increase in the number of police cars. That is not to say that the police cars are causing the accidents. There is another variable that is causing the accidents, and that other variable also then leads to an increase in the observation of police cars. That's a cause, and that's not a cause and effect. That is an association. If we did a study where we cut the brake pipes on a number of cars, and then we had another number of cars and we left the brake pipes alone, as long as all of the variables were similar between the two groups, if we then noticed an increase in the frequency of accidents in those cars where we cut the brake pipes, we could be fairly confident statistically that those accidents were caused by the cutting of the brake pipes. So the police car association, the police car example is an association. It's a cause. It's not a cause and effect. It's a correlation, an association or a correlation. The cutting of the brake pipes would actually be a cause and effect. And there are different scientific methodologies to show different things. But if we look at the nutritional literature that's often reported in the mainstream, what we tend to find is that associations are mixed with cause and effects. And I will now give you some examples of nutritional examples so that you can understand where I'm coming from. Saturated fat in the diet is associated with an increase in plasma cholesterol levels. There have been a number of studies that have looked at those people who consume more saturated fat, and it's been found that they do sometimes have higher levels of plasma cholesterol. Firstly, there are lots of nuances to this, and it's very difficult to go into all of them. But I'll give a very brief overview of fibre. As you increase your saturated fat content in your diet, you tend to eat less fibre, because foods containing saturated fat tend to be low in fibre. Fibre has been shown to lower plasma cholesterol levels. If you measure an association between saturated fat and cholesterol levels, you have an association there. Yes, you have more saturated fat in your diet, you have a higher risk, there's more likelihood that you'll have higher plasma cholesterol levels. That doesn't mean that the saturated fat has caused the increase in plasma cholesterol levels. It is more likely, based on other science, that it is the reduction in the fibre content in those people who have high saturated fat diets that is actually the cause of the change. But you can't ever make, if it's an association that's been recorded, you can't ever make the cause and effect jump. You can't go to that and say, okay, if there's an association, that means saturated fat or fibre. You can't say either of those things is the cause. All you can say is there is an association. There are many such associations that are reported in the nutritional literature. For example, as your plasma cholesterol levels go up, you have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, that risk is an association. Those people with higher plasma levels of certain lipoproteins have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But from that data, you cannot say that it is the plasma lipoproteins that are causing the cardiovascular disease. And this is one of the biggest problems, both in terms of layman understanding scientific literature, and also I think in some cases scientists. I don't think nutritional scientists really understand this data themselves. I don't think they really fully understand their interpretation of some of the data sometimes. And of course, there are scientists that deliberately misinterpret the data in order to be able to suit their agenda, because they are paid by particular agents that have a particular viewpoint that they want the public to believe. Now, this is very important, because when you look at reports of nutritional studies that have been done, it's obviously, as I said last week, it's very important to know if they've been done in cell culture, because the relevance to animals and particularly humans is very limited. But obviously, if you see an association, you have to be very wary. Now, also, you have to be very careful, because sometimes these headlines don't even mention that it's only an association that's been found. You see a headline that says saturated fat causes cardiovascular disease or causes heart attacks. When you actually look at the citation that's given or the study that's been done, you find it was an association, and therefore the headline is disingenuous, the entire report is disingenuous, and the conclusion that's been drawn from that scientific study is actually incorrect, and it shouldn't actually have ever been made. So you've got to be very wary of associations and cause and effects. A cause and effect is a much more rigorous way of measuring something. You are then able to say that substance A has a particular effect, and you usually need a human clinical trial, usually placebo-controlled, randomized. That they're called the gold standard in science for a reason, and that's because the controls in them are very rigorous. There is usually a double-blind placebo. In other words, the researchers and the subjects don't know whether they're getting the drug or a placebo. And they're also usually randomized, so people swap over between the groups. And therefore, doing all of those things within the study design means it's much more likely that you can bring out and actually confirm that drug A, or whatever it is that you give, nutrient A, has a particular effect. Epidemiology is very interesting, and just as with cell culture, it has a use. It's very, very useful. Epidemiology is very good at looking at the risk of disease amongst a population and looking at correlations within a certain population. But it has a limited way of you have to be very limited in the way you interpret the data. Using epidemiology with clinical trials is very useful and can be a very good way of interpreting and looking at the true picture. But so that's all I really wanted to say. I wanted to say, when you're looking online and you're reading about nutrition, it's a good idea to educate yourself in how science works. There is, on my blog, there is a section on statistics, and there is a certain amount of limited. I've tried to explain how certain statistical tests are done and the nuances of study design, in order that you can actually be able to teach yourself how basic science works, and therefore you can interpret the science yourself without having to rely on somebody else to do it. Because as soon as you rely on a third agent to be able to tell you what's going going on, it's very easy for them to lie to you or feed you disinformation, and that's very important that you manage to cut those people out and you go to the sources of the information yourself. So I hope that was useful. Whenever you read a scientific study, from the information I gave you last week and this week, was it done in cell culture? If it was, what relevance does that have to human tissue or even animal tissue? Secondly, are we looking actually as a cause and effect, as drug A caused a biochemical parameter change, or are we looking at an association? Is there one thing that's changing and at the same time something else is changing, in which case we cannot infer that either of those variables is actually the cause of the change. So that's very important. I hope that was useful. If you have any comments on this video, please leave them in the comments box below, and as always I'll try to get back to you, and in the meantime take care, and I will see you next week for another video.